Welcome to Fortify Your Future, a podcast for professionals who have executive oversight or aspirations of leading the safety and security function for their organization. I'm your host, Ken Carrasco, and joining me today is Michael Gips. Now, Michael is a prominent executive and thought leader in security and risk management, as well as an attorney, writer, journalist, researcher, and business professional. He is managing director of the Enterprise Security Risk Management practice at Kroll. Previously, Mike served as the Chief Global Knowledge and Learning Officer for ASIS International, where he was also responsible for ASIS's corporate security function. Mike has received many commendations, including Top 40 Global Thought Leader from Life Safety Alliance, years 2024 and 2025, Top 20 Most Influential Security Leaders in the Americas from Security Journal Americas, 2023 and 2025, and the #1 Most Influential Global Security Thought Leader in security from IFSCC in the year 2022. He's a graduate of Tufts University and Harvard Law School. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining me.
Ken, it's a real pleasure to be on the show. You make me blush with those commendations.
Well deserved. Now, you and I don't know each other very well, but I have been following you. I'd consider myself, in terms of social media terms, a lurker, and someone who consumes your content. I certainly do watch you and watch your content. I've been an admirer of the information that you put out into the industry. You're certainly well respected, and so a lot of times you need no introduction, as they say, right? So I'm looking forward to this conversation today. We're going to be talking about your new book, and that's just come out on Amazon and is available. And the name of the book is It's Not in the Manual: Real World Leadership for Security and Risk Professionals. And so we'll get into that. There's some areas that I really want to take a little bit of a deep dive into, and I'm looking forward to doing that. But before we start, I like to lead off the podcast with what I call lead with value. So what's one thing that you could provide to our audience in terms of something that's actionable, that's something that they can take away?
For taking away from this conversation, if they want to reach out to me, I mentored formally and informally many young and mid-career and senior professionals, and it's not a one-way street. I actually get as much from them as they do from me. They could connect with me on LinkedIn or reach out to me on LinkedIn. I don't like to really throw my email address out there or my phone number, but I'm not too hard to find. So I am eager to make new connections, to help people in their career. I've had people who are well known in the industry reach out to me and be surprised that I got back to them. I said, why wouldn't I get back to you? They said, well, you're probably busy. It's like, yeah, but this is what I do. This is,
Okay.
and I learned from you as well. So I hope, that kind of, and it's not transactional, it's relational. So I like to build and maintain relationships. So that's certainly something I hope that listeners, viewers can take from today.
That's great. No, that's wonderful. Yeah, and I'll provide a link to your LinkedIn page where they can connect with you. Really appreciate that. And as a reminder to our audience, actually, it's been great, wonderful. All of my guests thus far in season 1 have offered, that same opportunity to make a connection and build relationships and assist those that perhaps have questions, about some of the content that we've covered through the course of the season. So for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, go back and look at some of the previous episodes. And if there are individuals that you would like to communicate with on a one-on-one basis, all of the guests have been open to doing that. So we really certainly appreciate that, Michael. So thank you for that generous opportunity, and I appreciate that. And this is my last episode for season 1. So I feel as though we're ending this season, our first season, very strong with having you as our last guest for this first season. So it's such a great topic in terms of, the timing of it as well. But what I wanted to talk about in particular, things that caught my attention from reading your book, the first of which is this idea of whole of person leadership as a model. And it just caught my attention. I really appreciated, the content in and around that. But can you help our audience really understand what that means and sort of define that for them?
Sure. I like to use the example of the TV show Severance. I don't know if it's a streaming series. I don't know if you've watched it, but it's about, um, it takes place in a time where people's brains are segmented. They have a work brain and they have a, um, personal life brain. They go to work and their complete consciousness is devoted to work. So they really have one personality, and then they physically come out. Basically, a switch is turned, and they're completely different. They inhabit the same body, but they're really two different people. The personality at work has no idea what the person is doing in their personal life, and vice versa. And it creates some really great philosophical and life issues. When growing up, I grew up with a father who was he was a typical 60s, 70s father, 80s father, where he went to work, he brought home the bacon. My mother kind of worked, but she stayed at home. We had 5 kids, and he was very uninvolved with sort of the house, and he played with the kids and everything. He was a good dad, so I don't mean to, any disrespect. But my mother ran the house, and it was kind of it's like you asked my father to intervene in certain things. Like, okay, it was punishment, he would do it, but intervene in certain things. Like, well, mom says this, like, oh, she runs the house, and it's like, oh, come on, like, take the lead here. Like, you could overrule mom on this or whatever. And he was like, I mean, he wasn't an idiot, right? He's like, no way. So I thought, oh, my dad was kind of like very passive. And then one day I was a kid, I went to work with him, and he worked in New York City, and I went to his office, and he was in a leadership role. And he walked in there, and my perception of him changed immediately. He was like, everyone wanted his attention. He was dynamic. They wanted his opinion. Look at this, Mr. Gibbs, blah, 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 blah. What do you think of that? And there was basically, and he was engaging and he was commanding, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is not my dad. Who is this guy? And that made me think, we're the parts of ourselves that we show can be very different depending on the audience we're with, the situation, the geography, and that I've seen a lot. And thinking over it over the years, I see people who do not present as leaders, right? They are kind of shy, or they don't want attention, or they wait for other people to do things, but they will step up in certain situations and blow your mind. And I got interested in the whole of person philosophy, which says you're not, you can take different aspects of your personality, different leadership aspects, and apply it to other parts of your life. Now, you might not necessarily not want to. You may be a leader in one thing and not in another, or feel comfortable in one area where you're an expert and step to the fore. But how people who don't think they're leaders can actually tap into some of the characteristics they have. If you're say middle manager at work, and or a coder or something, or a guard even, but you're the captain of your church softball team, or you run you run some not for profit like fundraiser or something, or any other leadership role. Can you transfer those elements, those traits to your work life? And under what situations can you do that? And it's not just a one-way street, because I worked with one person who I thought was great. She was very low key, didn't want to, do anything more. She worked 9 to 5, didn't want to take responsibility for anything, kind of like check in, check out, great work, never like a centimeter more than was required. And we went to, as an outing, we went to an escape room, and she took over. She was amazing. She was like, oh, we need to do this, this. She was assigning roles, but not being dominant, and really encouraging people. And we got out of there, and it was like, oh my gosh, this person's transformed. And I talked to her and her boss and said, well, maybe we should give her some more responsibility in her terms, right? So we talked to her. She was amenable. We created this job for her where she could use those characteristics. Lo and behold, she hated it. Right? He was like, this isn't fun anymore. This is not an escape room. It's not
Yeah.
theoretical anymore. I don't really want to do this with, these other things. I liked what I did before. We rolled everything back. We realized we made the mistake. We didn't, a lot of people are promoted, the Peter principle. You're
Yeah.
promoted into your, where you reach your level of incompetence. And we realized we made the mistake. And this person liked to do other things. She had an outside life, and that was where her priority was. It didn't hurt her work, but we rolled it back. And that was a situation we have to be more careful with how we sort of assess people's leadership potential. and how that translates into the workplace. Now, there are other situations where it worked. We saw little things like, oh, this person can take on more. Let's focus on this aspect and let them lead with this characteristic, and people will see them more as a leader rather than a follower, at least in specific situations. For example, you can road test somebody's leadership by having them head a working group or some sort of committee, or and see how they do there. And if people take to them, they follow them, they believe in them, that's a dry run. And then you can expand it from there. And then before you make a rash decision, like I did with, you know, the person's supervisor, and say, okay, let's just throw that person right into the thick of things. So there are ways to get there. And so whole of person leadership basically means you can pull various aspects out of your work life, your social life, your volunteer life, and various other aspects, your athletic life, and they aren't one dimensional. You can apply them across the spectrum, but you have to be careful and intentional and mindful how you do all these things, because it's not just, okay, they're good here, they're going to be good there. No, but you can make it work in the right situation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it may even go both ways. You could also perhaps suggest, based upon things that you're doing outside where you've demonstrated, some leadership, but you've not yet had an opportunity within the work environment, perhaps maybe making a suggestion. And to your point about piloting, certain projects or certain things that are maybe trial runs so that you can demonstrate that, or at least have the opportunity to demonstrate that as well. So no, I think that's, great information in terms of, both sides of it, is really understanding that there's things that, you might not have visibility to, that somebody is doing outside of the work environment. And I love the story about your father in terms
Mm,
of how he sort of shut it down. I mean, because that sort of connects with me. I remember distinctively coming home and telling my wife occasionally at times where I'm like, I just don't want to make any decisions today. I've been making decisions all day long. Can you decide on where we're going to go to dinner or something like that? Or, we need to take the kids someplace, and, there's choices that we need to make or decisions that we need to make. And I'm like, okay, I'm all decisioned out today.
mhm.
Can you make the decisions, for the rest of the afternoon or the weekend? And sort of having that ability to shut it off and shut it on. But no, that definitely, the point resonated with me. So very good, man. Very good. Well, hey, another thing I wanted to talk about, that sort of in a lot of ways has a connection here, is volunteerism as a leadership accelerator. Really interesting to me. Talk to us about how volunteerism can actually accelerate you as a leader, or go down a path where that may help you or assist you in that process.
This is a cheat code to leadership. This may be the most valuable thing you get out of this, or your listeners get out of this. When you're at work, you're required to do certain things, right? It's in the job description. You're somewhat limited by the structure. Who will listen to you? How to get ahead? I mean, there are opportunities, but you have a fixed role. And when you volunteer, the sky is the limit. Usually in a lot of places, and I'm quoting Becky Lane, who I'm the president of the Life Safety Alliance, and she's the acting CEO. And I quote her in the book and saying, when you're a volunteer, you're often the volunteer. That means you step into the role, everybody sees you as the person who's going to deliver, because there are relatively few people who'll say they'll do something and then deliver consistently, on time, well, reliably. And that person is a commodity, right? It's like they say that you always want to ask a favor, ask somebody to do something who's too busy to do it, because they know how to manage their time, right? They get things done. And I found that if you step into leadership, especially early, I mean, if you go into ASIS or something and you want to be on the board, you're going to have to wait in line for a while. But for any role, there's a path, right? And there's a path to get to the ASIS board. There's a path to get anywhere. And a lot of times it starts with just being the person who puts up their hand. And in the book, I have several pages of volunteer leadership opportunities, how difficult it is to get into it, how difficult the workload required, the lift required, and how difficult it is to sort of rise in the ranks. So it goes from everything to like association ambassador to a judge for some sort of award scheme, a advisor for, corporate advisor, or getting on some sort of board. I mean, that would be on the high end, to volunteering to review articles for like Security Journal or something like that. There's a lot of different steps you can take. And once you establish yourself as a reliable person, people from other organizations will want you. Good example is a good example is Matt Porcelli. I don't know if you've had him on your show. Everyone knows who he is, right?
No, not yet.
Okay, so you probably should have him. He is a he works for a guard services firm, which is pretty, he's not a CSO, but he projects and he's a great guy and very knowledgeable. He projects higher than his titular role because we got him in the Life Safety Alliance, but he also is a prominent ASIS advocate and volunteer, ISRM, which is the David Rubin Strategic Risk Management Group, also pretty well known, and IFPO as well, International Foundation for Protection Officers. And when I asked him to be an LSA, I was like, are we, getting like the very bottom of what he can do, like the remainder? But, you ask someone who's busy to help you, and now he's become a key member of the team. So someone like him, he's elevated his profile and his status through for volunteer leadership. Really, if you look at his job, and this is not an insult, but he's not the CSO of Coca-Cola or, or Boeing or whatever, or Microsoft. He's at a pretty big guard services company. He's very well respected, but he's not, an executive there. He's mid to high level, but he really punches above his weight through his thought leadership. He publishes a lot of publications. He receives well-deserved recognition, awards for things he's done, a lot of times for his volunteer leadership. He's a great mentor. He's always there to lend an ear. So someone like him, and he's sort of the apotheosis. He's the highest level of bringing yourself up that way by your bootstraps. And he just stepped in and said, yes, I'm happy to help with that. He's a giving person. If you call someone a servant leader, he's a servant leader. And there's still lots of opportunities like that. There's always more organizations. There's always new roles. Like if you wanted to, for example, at ASIS, they have women in security or next gen. Get involved in a chapter level. If they don't have that role and you fit that, or that's something that aligns with your values and your interests, like get involved with that. Volunteer to speak on a topic, and you don't have to go. You don't have to be someone who has all these credentials and has written 100 articles and spoken many, many times. But if you know a topic or you have an interesting perspective, say, hey, whatever group might be SIA or ASIS or IFPO or whatever organization, IHSS, approach people and say, hey, I'm an expert on this, and I think this would be good to have an article or podcast or even a blog post or somehow address it. And they're always looking for people who will do something, who's their substance behind their words and new takes. Like a lot of people have said to me, I've recommended people to write for certain publications, and they said, but no one knows who I am. It's like, they don't care. They don't care that who you are specifically. They care that you know what you're talking about. You're credible and you're a new voice, because they're always trying to elevate new voices. You don't want to keep recycling the same four people. It's like you get bored, It's, the same few people. It's Michael Gips again with Matt Porcelli, whatever, writing all these articles. Like, that's great, but you need new perspectives, new infusion of talent. So that volunteerism, you step into the role and you gain, not only does it reflect well on you, increase your profile, but I'd say it increases your confidence, and you'll be able to step into bigger roles on the job. Now, I don't want to be unequivocally, one way about this, because if you get too involved in volunteer stuff, it could curtail your ability to, produce on the job, right? You don't want to spend all this time and interfere with who's paying you. So you've got to balance it. But a lot of times your volunteer duties would benefit your organization, right? So if I say, okay, I'm with Kroll and I know all this stuff, I write about all these different topics, I'm an expert there. It's, as long as I'm credible, it should redound to the benefit of Kroll. It's like, oh, you have experts there. These are the type of people you hire. Kroll knows how to do that, blah, blah, blah. And so everyone benefits, as long as you're not, spending all your, first of all, you have to be credible. And you have to be, you can't be doing this for kind of cynical reasons or whatever, right?
Sure.
But this will help you in your career, should help your business, should help your confidence, and it will allow you to raise other people, which I think is the most important aspect of all this. So I think, as I said, it's a cheat. Volunteering for leadership can exalt you into other roles. Other organizations will want you, and it may advance your career within your company, or someone will recruit you from another company because you're going to make a lot of connections. You're going to raise your profile. People are like, this person knows what
Mhm.
they're talking about. We want them to work for us. So as I said, it's kind of a cheat code.
Yeah, definitely a great strategy. And I think, all too often people really, really don't consider it. I think part of it, to your point, where they often get caught up in, their current role at their company. And if I had to do it all over again, it's one of the things that I certainly tell people, as I would have been much more active in my local chapter. I would have spent more time building relationships early on, because early on I was just, at my role at Cisco. I was just dedicated to what we were doing, what we were focused in on, and did not participate from the standpoint of the industry at large, and just was focused in on what we were doing there at our company. And today, I tell people this all the time. I said, if I could go back, establishing, building relationships is the most important thing you can do. And today, fast forward, you start thinking about, volunteerism, being a mentor to other folks. And now, Michael, I don't know how you feel about it, but my position is now that mentorship is no longer something you do as sort of a side thing, or to, volunteer as, when to me, it's an extension of leadership. You almost have to be an active mentor today in today's world. And there's a lot to that, and there's other things that are connected to that. We talked about thought leadership a little bit before, we started recording this episode. And my position on the reason I do this podcast, and the reason I'm active on LinkedIn or I post things, is because I feel as though today you almost have to do those things to be in this very competitive marketplace where you're looking for work or looking for clients, no matter, what that looks like in terms of, your role, or as an individual company or a consultant or a security company. You really have to be participatory in what's going on within the industry, and push yourself out of your, at least for me, I have to push myself out of my comfort zone to do things like speaking at GSX. Those are things that were suggested to me. They weren't things that I initially had taken the initiative to go do because it was something that I really wanted to do. They were suggestions from people that I respected, and they thought, you ought to try speaking, get out there and reestablish yourself. Because personally, I had left the industry for almost 10 years, and I came back in 2022. And so I started following this path of re-engaging in the industry. And I found that uh, becoming a thought leader is not what I thought that meant before, in terms of how I defined it in years past. Today, I think it's something that I now advocate to others to engage. I mean, we characterize it by calling it, thought leadership. And I think, you can unpack that. That can mean a lot of different things. But I really do believe you've got to put yourself out there. And for a lot of folks, it's uncomfortable. So can you talk to us a little bit about becoming a thought leader as you've articulated in your book, and why it's important?
Sure. Just for a little background, I kind of had an unfair head start because I was a writer and then the editor of Security Manager magazine. So I had a pulpit, right? I could write articles on, and I had access to anyone I wanted to talk to. So I'd written, by the time I realized, oh, I can be, or I am a thought leader, I'd written many, many articles, appeared, spoken at, many shows and been on podcasts and things like that. It was only when really, so at the end of my ASS career, and then when I started my own company, that I was like, okay, it's because a lot of what I did for ASS members was what I would do as a mentor now. I would help them, guide them, work with them, helping them develop their career, or maybe benchmark for them, helping with policies and procedures. Okay, here's a standard you might use or whatever. And so I got a broad range of knowledge without really thinking, okay, I want to be a thought leader. But you're right that if you want to get attention, stick out from the crowd positively, you've got to, or it helps. You don't have to do anything, but put yourself out there in an area where you feel comfortable, and you're gonna get attacked. I'm gonna just warn you. It's like, it's not always comfortable. You might want to decide whether you, meaning anybody out there, like, do I want to be a thought leader? Because you stick your head up, someone's going to shoot. That's just the way it is. And even if they don't shoot, people are going to say, "Oh, what the hell does that person know?" Or they're just self congratulating, or they're just Johnny come lately. And people talked about this before, and now they're just, they're on the news now talking about these things. What the heck do they know? So you've got to earn this stuff, right? And there's some people who successfully kind of pop in, like, it's like, where did this person come from? And they immediately establish credibility because they're good. It helps to have bona fides, right? Or bona fides. But you should think about what thought leadership entails, because what kind of thought leader do you want to be? What areas do you want to cover? Who is your audience? And what means, what media? So are you going to be the person who always posts on LinkedIn? Are you going to be writing articles? Are you going to be speaking at conferences? Are you doing podcasts? Are you going to be an expert that they quote in articles? You can even be the person who testifies, in front of a legislature, or does expert witness work or whatever, because that's, you're a thought leader in a way there as well. So to get to be a thought leader, I recommend sort of starting small, and but you have to go and don't sit on your butt. People aren't going to go ask you to do these things, or if they do, you're lucky. So, for example, there's a guy, Harry Pratap, and his last name used to be Singh, but now it's Shekhar or what. His last name changed, so I don't want to get it wrong.
Mhm.
Indian security professional. He was a security manager at a metals company. Pretty big job, but he wasn't really into thought leadership. And he reached out to me and he's like, "Hey, how do I get a higher profile?" And I said, "What do you know? What can you talk about?" And it just happens that I had been asked to speak to the ASS chapter in Atlanta. I think it was Atlanta, on whatever topic it was. It was like protective intelligence or something. I said, "Look, I'd love to have your perspective from India. That's not an area I know, and metals and whatever you've experienced." And I said, you can pick up whatever you want to do. I'll do the nuts and bolts if you want. You can do the other stuff, or the examples, or the lessons learned, or vice versa. And I was eager to have his perspective because I didn't know it. He's another colleague I'd have, another voice, like another colleague I can turn to. He was eager to get involved. He was happy that I brought him in. And it was low friction, right? It wasn't like he had to carry the whole thing and be nervous about it. It's like, anytime you feel nervous or you don't know what you're doing, I'll step in. And he was great. He didn't need that. And maybe we did one other thing later. I think he wrote an article and I helped him with, making more of an engaging article. And since then, he's like keynoting conferences and writing a lot of articles. He's like
Uh,
Pencil Bob. So,
uh,
and not because of me. I was just a facilitator. It's because he had, he took it with it by himself. He took it within himself to, to lift himself up and to step into that kind of limelight and challenge himself. And he found someone in me that was happy to facilitate. Because these things are always win-win situations. And even if it weren't, I would still do it for the benefit of the community. If you have somebody who's serious about benefiting the profession, increasing the level of professionalism in whatever way, increasing knowledge or skill sets, or I want to be part of that. I want to encourage it. And I will win from that too, because from my association with that person and from what they can help me with. And a lot of times, like, I'll speak with somebody like, I don't know if you know Don Morrow, who he just changed his name to Morrow. He's an expert in AI and security. I don't know the technical stuff. I know what I know about AI and security, which is on a general level, a decent amount, but how all the underlying technology works, he's a master at that. So I've kind of brought into some things, and I'm learning more from him than he is from me, I'm sure. So I think every mentor-mentee relationship is reciprocal. You will learn as much. As people have said to me, "Oh, like, I'm so glad you're my mentor." And I was like, "I thought you were my mentor." That's how it should be,
yeah.
you know? And that's how it really is. If it's someone who's like, "I'll tell you everything you need to know from on high," maybe it's not the right person. You want to
Yeah.
give and take.
Well, what I like about the content in your book in this particular space is that you give many suggestions as to what you can do and how to get started, and that's important because a lot of people they feel very uncomfortable. There's a lot of folks that sort of prefer to be under the radar. That's just the nature of how they are, and it's not for everybody, right? No question. And I love the point about if you pop your head up, someone's going to shoot at you. I've said this with the previous guest that you're not successful until you have haters. That's kind of my line, right? That's what I tell people.
Mhm.
You once you know you're getting some hate, you know that your content's resonating negatively with someone, and that's okay. It just comes with the territory, and you're never gonna be able to please 100% of the people. You just have to get past that and move forward with it, and it's almost a part of the process, and I think, again, the idea of participating on a panel, I think, is a great suggestion for those that aren't comfortable yet being that lone person in front of a group of people or being on stage. So the panel idea, I think, is really, really key and important for folks that are a little hesitant to do that. So great suggestions, Michael. Thank you for that. Now, one thing I did want to touch base on is sort of a long time pain point that, for 30 years I've heard this, and it's just one of those things that doesn't seem to go away. It just keeps on and on and on. And no matter what scenario you have or what company or what type of situation, but sort of that idea of why don't I have a seat at the table, right? Pain point has been around for as long as I've been in the industry. But can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on why it still seems to be an area in which, as an industry, we still struggle with?
Sure. And when I first started dealing with this years and years ago, I took it as a sort of a no-brainer that we security would want to sit at the table. But I've talked to many people over the years who say, why do we want a seat at the table? Why don't we want one step down from that, where we have a great advocate who will tell the C-suite or tell the CEO our value, because they're more eloquent than us. They have more power. They run a whole function like legal or whatever, or operations or HR or whatever it may be, which is a interesting counterpoint. And there's a lot to commend it. Other people say, no, that's sort of, that we'll always be in a secondary role or whatever. We'll always be, subservient to the higher ups. So first of all, you want to consider that. Maybe you're in a better position not having a seat at the table. But the problem with, think of the people with a seat at the table: CEO, chief operations officer, they run the business. Chief legal officer, usually they're in charge of a lot of times, legal risk litigation. That's existential to a company, right? HR is, your human resources. That is existential. Who, the quality of the people you get, how you manage those people, how you develop those people, how you replace them, train them, blah, blah, blah. That's essential. And then there are some other things depending on, chief information officer, because everything is data right now. So you're nothing without stream of data and being able to harness that. And then in some other companies, it might be other functions like chief risk officer, or chief strategy officer, or chief privacy officer, or other things. You look at the ones that aren't, maybe like facilities, safety, if you're not a chemical company or whatever, and other functions that are considered peripheral because they aren't sort of existential to the company. Like you can get by just kind of, and I'll put this very bluntly, like in a half-assed way, right? At least that's the thought. Now, ever since we had, cyber came onto the scene, say 30 years ago, and increasingly since then, cyber risk has surpassed physical risk by far as a much more likely vector of risk and threat, because anyone from anywhere with an internet connection, even from their phone, can attack, thousands, millions of companies at once, right? Remotely, with very little to no possibility of getting caught. And then the privacy implications, so if your customer's data, your staff data comes out, the legal ramifications, the financial ramifications of all that. And every company, guaranteed, if you haven't at all connected digitally, you're being attacked constantly, all the time. And it may not be, it could be your website, it could be your servers, it could be email, through phishing attacks, a million different ways, ransomware. Whereas in physical security, even though we hear about the big attacks, the terrorist attacks, the 9/11s of the world, odds of that happening to a company in that grandiose of a way are minuscule. And think of a school shooting. You're guaranteed to have how many school shootings a year? I don't know, 25. I'm just making that up. Probably more than that, 50 school shootings a year. But there are tens of thousands of schools. So the likelihood of your school having a school shooting at any given time is very small. The odds of any school having it is very high. But that's why it can't happen to me, because in most cases they're right. It won't happen to them. It'll happen to somebody else. And it's just pretty by luck, or maybe through their good security or whatever, that it doesn't happen to them. But for a company, cyber risk is a constant thing. And it's elevated, and it's got the attention of the C-suite. And something like, you look at some of these World Economic Forum reports, and then they ask about the C-suite about what the biggest risks are. There's never a physical security thing up there. It's like terrorism, or crime. It's like 1%. The big things are, um, environmental risks, currency risks, legal risks, process risks, and a lot of other things. Things like natural disasters, which security often, is responsible for, that comes in high. But that's not the same thing as an intentional breach or whatever, a physical security attack or a theft or something like that. These things can often be written off by insurance. If there's someone steals pharmaceuticals or whatever, it's just a write-off. It's a tiny percent. Whereas if people think that their private data isn't safe and the company doesn't do anything to protect it, that's a massive reputational hit. You see that companies, when they have a physical security attack, there's workplace violence or whatever, many companies have gotten hit. Have you ever, only in the cases where they handled it terribly, or, the follow-up was poor or whatever, or they completely bungled the response, do you see any kind of lasting impact? There's many, many companies like, okay, they had an attack, they dealt with it. They're no worse for the wear. There are other companies, where they've lost data. Now, there's plenty that have survived that as well, but they've gone out of business because there's no more credibility, or the value of the data they lost, it was so monumental that, and so that's one of the reasons why security often doesn't have a seat at the table. Another reason, and if I'm um, pontificating here, stop me. Another
Mhm.
reason is the backgrounds of a lot of security professionals. When you're a CFO, they're trained in finance, or maybe they have an accounting degree. Lawyers will have a law degree. CEOs have sort of a broad degree, a broad range of experience, and maybe they're entrepreneurs, or they went to business school, whatever. But most other folks, or a lot of the other folks, have sort of specialties that have trained them how to deal in the corporate setting. When we get to security professionals, a lot of times they're plucked from law enforcement or the military. And not to put those people down, some of the best security professionals I know came from those areas, but they knew what they were missing. They knew the skill sets they had to improve. They knew that their mindset had to change, and that it couldn't be, they couldn't be a corporate cop. They understood, okay, now we're working for a company. We don't have an unlimited budget. We have to make hard choices on risk and risk mitigation, and we have to know how the company works. We have to be able to communicate. We can't just demand things. Like when you're in law enforcement, you say, stop, and people will listen to you. And if you say that to, a senior executive, they'll flip you off. They're like, no, it's like, what do you do? You're just saying no, but you don't understand what goes into this. The most successful people, like I know, I'll just throw out this name, the former head of security for Johnson & Johnson years ago is Kevin Donovan. He came from the FBI. He was a senior role. When I talked to him, I thought, when I first met him, I was like, okay, FBI guys, he's going to lead through authority and, hey, you know what I am, like swagger into the building. And he was the opposite, self-effacing. And he's like, I do nothing about corporate security. I immerse myself into it. How this company makes money, how it operates, what customers expect from us, what our reputation is, how the policies and procedures fit into the company culture, blah, 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 blah. And he really, kind of humbled himself to learn. And he was one of the best corporate security professionals at that time I certainly witnessed. And it's because he acknowledged what he didn't know, and he was willing to learn, and he's willing to adapt. I don't want to put all the blame on the feet of, military or law enforcement, but a lot of it goes to security. Security doesn't really have a role a lot of times in small to mid-sized companies. There's just one person who's kind of given that role, but they're not a security person. They may be the cyber person, or they be facilities. And it's not until a certain point in the maturity of an organization, they think, okay, now I need a real bona fide security person. And whereas you're always going to have a CEO, you almost always have a COO, you almost always from the from the beginning have a CIO and CFO, right? Because you couldn't found a company without those. No one would invest in
Mm.
your company, right? But as a CSO or head of security, it's like, no, we don't need that. Other functions will take that role. It's not inherent to the company, and it's grafted from the outside. So it's not something that, you don't grow up usually to be a chief security officer. You come in from another role. I mean, there are a few people who, start as intelligence officers or whatever, and private intelligence or loss prevention or
Mhm.
guards, whatever, and move up. But they're very, very few. Often they don't get the chance, or they take other opportunities that are better laid out for them. It's like, well, why am I going to struggle doing this when I can have a faster route to the top through as chief operations or chief of information or whatever? And then you have people who are doing, so as I was saying, there may not be a role for head of security. So, okay, we need a head of security now. So this is a mid to large size company. And still, a lot of them do not have discrete security functions. Then they say, okay, the HR person, you know, come up with a job description. We need a security person. They'll pull something off the internet or whatever, and it'll be for an ex-cop, and, sometimes I'll see CSO roles and it says you must have like a current firearm license. Yeah, it's like for a CSO, it's like a firearms license. You must have security guard training. It's like, you don't want someone, I mean, great that has skills, but requiring, that's like saying the CEO should have, experience with every minute aspect of the company. Like he has to have worked in the mailroom or something, or she has to work in the mailroom. It's like not equating security to the mailroom, but you understand my point. It's like an executive level person shouldn't be expected to do what an entry level person is. But in security, everything is lumped together a lot of the times. I still see that. And that is also perception and self fulfilling. And it's really only sort of like you work with recruiters like Jerry Brennan or Kathy Lavender, and they know better. And they're advising, you don't want this type of people, but they have, for as much authority and influence they have, it's still limited, right? We're still working sort of in our own, in our own echo chambers. And it's like getting out to the HR people and saying, no, that's not what a CSO, oh, whatever, we'll get what we get. This isn't our top priority or whatever. And people like those have been working to try to change, and they have been helping change it, but it's still an artifact, of sort of like, all right, there's a new position. We know a lot of people, we want a position of authority, right? Someone who's like, no one's going to mess with us if we get the head of the CIA or the New York Police Department or Secret Service or whatever, or some high level military, general or whatever, or senior lieutenant general. And that's fine as long as they know how to adapt. But a lot of times they think this is my retirement job. Yeah, I'm just going to coast. So I give you a lot of reasons, and all those, in my opinion, I'm sure people will say, they have room to disagree for sure. That's one thing that holds us back from having real or actual authority in the C-suite or with the C-suite, because of all those factors that have to do with, skill sets, where we get our talent from, and how an organization grows organically, and, where they consider their value lies.
I know, agreed. And I think, and I've made mention to this before, and have publicly stated this myself. It's one of those things where we, as an industry, keep drawing from the same labor pool, and whether it's law enforcement or former military, former government, and they are trained, and their experience and skills are no question come from very structured environments and are relevant. But it's, to me, when I think about things, when I think about how they translate into the private sector, you would think most people would understand that it's not going to be, a simple transition, and it's just going to flow right over, and you're going to apply the same sort of models and approaches in the private sector as you've done in the public sector. And it's to no fault of their own. That's what I really want to say as well, right? Because they've been trained, and they have a very specific set of skills that they've developed through the course of their career, and that made them successful in their environment in the public sector. It's really to no fault of their own, and they're getting hired into a role that, now they find themselves, well, wait a minute, things are much different in terms of how I'm applying what I know and learn. And then it's just dependent upon, as you said, the ability of the person to adapt to their environment and sort of, gather as much information as possible to build that business acumen, and transition effectively. I've seen so many people crash and burn, and now it's one of the reasons why I like working with folks that are transitioning from public sector to private, and why I'd like to spend as much time as I do. That's sort of my volunteer, if you will, of trying to assist folks coming out of the public sector into the private sector and as helping them as best I possibly can. Well, and certainly, content like yours that you're producing and talk about in this book, no question, are elements that people can take if they are transitioning into the private sector, if they're coming from areas in which, some of the areas we talked about, whether it's former government or former military or former law enforcement at all levels, whether it's local, state, or federal. There's valuable information in the contents of this book that will assist you in that transition. So again, I can't speak highly enough about your new book, Michael. I really appreciate your time and talking to us today. Any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for letting me elaborate on a lot of these ideas. And there's that and a lot more. And it's not so heavy in the book. There's a lighter side to it. For every bit of theory and dogma, there's a lot more real life examples and kind of lighter stuff that you can apply. But I was talking to a colleague of mine and I was telling him about the book, and he was really interested. And he said, I'm going to buy the book for my team so they can learn leadership. And I was like, that's great. And he goes, but what I would like to do is so you're building, it's not a manual, but I'd like something that explains how to apply what you're, step by step, even though it's kind of like making a manual out of it's not a manual. It's like, how can we take the lessons and build it into a leadership curriculum? I was like, hey, you got something there. Maybe we can work on that together. So that's something I have floating in my mind. Like, okay, there's a lot of ideas here. And while there are a lot of recommendations, like how to be a thought leader or how to get involved, to volunteer, to move up in leadership, there's also, I can't lay out in this book every possible way to develop leadership, specifically. Okay, here are skills and drills or whatever. Here's what you should do with your team. But that might be the next step. It's like the manual to it's not in the manual. It's
Mm,
sort of a tongue in cheek kind of thing. So
yeah.
that I'm thinking about maybe working with this other person on.
Nice, nice. Now that'd be great. I had someone on who authored a guide. It's called Leadership Uncomplicated by Brian Banta. And he's doing something very similar, right? Based upon the content of the book and the feedback that he got, there's certainly demand for it, right? In terms of the needs. And I've said this before, this year I've sort of dedicated myself to concentrate on this idea of working on leadership as a priority in terms of the security professional. And so everything leading up to this point has been a focus of mine to work in that space because to me, there really isn't anything out there that specifically addresses security professionals. I mean, certainly there's business management, there's things that you can do that talk about leadership within business and various programs in that realm. And there's, sort of short executive programs that are out there. But to me, something that really resonates with security professionals, especially for those folks that, currently perhaps are, maybe at the supervisor level, they're at the manager level within their environments and having a pathway to follow and understand and what is it going to take for them to get to that next level to incorporate the things that are important relative to business knowledge is important and how do you scale, right? You've touched on a number of things in the book and on today's episode. We could spend a full episode on just a single chapter, no question, in terms of the content that you have. And so I really do recommend people, take the opportunity to get Michael's book. Again, it's available on Amazon. It's not in the manual, Real World Leadership for Security and Risk Professionals. And I've really enjoyed, our conversation today. And
Me
thank you,
too.
Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure and honor.